And I think that's a good segue to our next speaker, Deborah Small. And I would say Deborah, without a doubt, really is the most articulate and passionate person on issues dealing with drug policy and war on drugs, worldwide. I just have to say that. But can you talk to us about just how we got where we are, just some of the history and connections and parallels that you see between alcohol prohibition of yesterday and drug prohibition today, as well as the politics around both?
So thank you all for being here, and thank you, Judge Burnett. That was like a perfect segue to what I want to talk about.
No, we've done this before.
I know, it's true. It's been a while, a long time, I tell you. So, I mean, I want to go back to Jesse Jackson's remarks at the very beginning, because he challenged us by saying that rather than thinking of the drug war as a failure, that in fact it's a success. It's a success at the things that it was set out to do, which was about not reducing drugs, but about policing poor people. And I think we have to remember that, because if you think about it, we already had a time in our country where we experimented with the idea of controlling people's behavior and access to something that they wanted. It was called alcohol prohibition. And what did that produce? It produced a lot of crime. It produced a lot of violence. Who were the people who were arrested? It wasn't the big guys who were smuggling liquor in, the Seagram manufacturers, etc. No, it was the immigrants. It was the poor people. It was the working class people in cities all over the country who the law was designed for in the first place. Because if you go back and look at the history of it, you see that the people who put forward these proposals did it specifically with the idea and intention of using it to control the poor, the marginalized, and the powerless. And, you know, Martin Luther King said that one of the ways that you know a law is unjust is if it was enacted by the majority to be imposed on the minority. So we need to actually ask ourselves, where are all the white drug users? The ones that we see on Intervention and Breaking Bad and Weeds and all the other programs that are on TV telling us that white folks are using drugs every day. How come we don't see them behind bars? Why is that? Because the goal of drug prohibition was never about controlling the drug use of the majority population. It was always to be about controlling us. And for me, the most important thing for us to think about is two things. One, the context for Nixon's declaring the war on drugs. What was going on just before that? Well, you had a civil rights movement of black people who reached a point where they said, we're tired of being second class with respect to the law. We want something different. And when we moved from demanding our basic civil rights to demanding human rights and economic rights, that's when we became a threat. So the drug war was about killing the black nationalist movement, and it was also about killing the peace movement, the anti-war movement, the movement of white people who decided that they didn't want to become corporate cogs either. And by criminalizing them and using the issue of drugs, then you no longer had to deal with the substance of what they were doing. You could now focus on them as criminals and lock them up and thereby shut their voices. And for the brother Garrison who talked earlier about the hundreds and thousands of our men who should be in our community being leaders, their voices were intentionally shut. They were intentionally put there in order to deprive us of the leadership and the kind of strong family structure that we need. But for me, the other thing that I feel is really important for us to talk about today is like where we are as a community about this. Because the reality is that the system would not be able to do it to us if we didn't tolerate it. And so for me, one of the conversations that we really need to have in our community is where we are in the punishment paradigm. Now, we know that America was built on punishment. The people who came here because they were fleeing punishment. Many of them were convicts who were sent here as felons. So we shouldn't be surprised that they brought with them that propensity for punishment, and they also brought us. And for 400 years, we were subject to the idea of punishment as a form of behavior modification. But now we need to look at where we've internalized that. Where is it that we not only have become so inured to it, that we do it to ourselves? because we're the ones who allow the police to keep snatching our young men and women away for things that they're not doing in the other community. I just read an article today in the New York Times where Mayor Bloomberg, when challenged on the reason why so many minority youth are being arrested for marijuana possession, an offense that was decriminalized 40 years ago in order to protect white youth, but is now the principal reason why young black and Latino men are being arrested. And what he said is that this was an effective crime-fighting tool, and the fact that these kids ended up having to spend 2 days in jail, being booked, fingerprinted, etc., was no big deal if it reduced crime. Now, you ask me whether or not he would say that in Larchmont, in Westchester, or any of the white communities in New York City, that he would have the nerve to stand up and say to people that our public safety depends on my humiliating your children, my putting them through something that I would never want to go through myself, but it's okay, because after all, I'm doing it for your own good. When are we as a community going to start saying no to that? Saying no to that. So I'm really happy to be here today, but quite frankly, I'm not in a conversation about reforming drug laws, and I'm not in a conversation about fixing drug addicts, because quite frankly, we're much more willing in our community to focus on fixing people than fixing institutions. But it's the institutions that have been hurting our people since the day we arrived here in Massachusetts. So we need to get off of that, you know, and really start focusing on that, which means that we need to end drug prohibition, not end reduced sentences, not put people into drug courts. We need to end prohibition. And if we end drug prohibition, we will find ourselves with the same set of circumstances that we did when we ended alcohol prohibition. It didn't get rid of alcoholism. It didn't get rid of people beating folks when they were using alcohol, but it did give us the opportunity to spend our money in a better way, to take it away from the criminal element. I don't know how many black folks I know who made money by running liquor stores, okay? You know, I mean, like, let's just be real about it. It gave us an opportunity to take a negative and reduce the negativity associated with it, not necessarily eliminate it completely. So I want us to have a conversation about the ability for us to regulate and control drugs, which is what we did prior to 1914. So let's not pretend this is some radical thing. There was a time when all the drugs that are currently illicit were legal, when they were controlled by doctors, where you got them from pharmacies. And in the first early years of drug prohibition, we had heroin maintenance clinics in the U.S. So don't let anybody tell you we can't do these things, that can only happen in Europe. No, it can happen here.
Thank you, Deborah.